Alright, so like Dr. France said, my name's Katie, and I'll be talking about democracy behind bars, exploring the implications of prisoner enfranchisement in Africa. So to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today, we'll take a look first at the research question that I used, as well as the foundation of the project, followed by some of the quantitative analysis that was used to come to our determination of why this issue of prisoner enfranchisement in Africa matters, and then we'll conclude by talking about some normative implications and some suggestions for future research. So to begin, I've created for you a map of the variation in prisoner disenfranchisement policies across the continent. So countries in red are countries where prisoners are not allowed to vote under any circumstance. Countries in yellow are places where prisoners are allowed to vote to some degree. So this might include like certain term sentence limitations. So like in Mali, prisoners with sentences up to 6 months can still participate in democratic processes. And finally, countries in green are countries where prisoners are completely enfranchised, so all prisoners have the right to vote no matter what. So you can see that there's a lot of variation on the continent. Almost a third of countries on the continent allow their prisoners to vote at least to some extent. So that leads us to the question of what factors explain this variation in prisoner disenfranchisement. And so why do we study this? There's a lot of literature talking about whether or not prisoners should have the right to vote around the world, not just in Africa. So one argument against this right to vote is that we shouldn't allow prisoners who have broken the social contract, who have done something against the rest of us in society, to participate in determining how that society should function. On the other hand, we can look at this idea that self-determination requires universal suffrage. So in order for a society to be truly functioning at its peak capabilities, we should be allowing every single person in that society to vote, even those behind bars. Another look at this includes critical race theory and talking about how around the world a disproportionate number of prisoners are not of white origin, and so therefore this represents a new method of suppressing non-white individuals. What's interesting though is that there are only about 3 or 4 studies that actually focus on Africa in particular, despite the fact that Africa and Latin America are the 2 regions most likely to disenfranchise their prisoners. And around the world, no other group of people is legally restricted from voting in most countries. So this is kind of a last frontier in terms of voting rights. So when we look at how this study was conducted, we looked at 12 variables. We did a quantitative analysis using correlational and linear regression modeling, and we found that the democracy index across the board was the #1 positive correlation to whether or not prisoners were allowed to vote across the continent. So basically, as a country was more democratized, the more likely they were to allow their prisoners to vote. So why does this matter? And much of my thinking originally was that this mattered because it provided a blueprint. So if you wanted to allow your prisoners to vote, you had to democratize. If you wanted to democratize, you had to be allowing your prisoners to vote. And these 2 things kind of went hand in hand. But as I thought about it more, I kind of changed my mind. And so why does this really matter? It doesn't. And I'm being a little dramatic here, but it only matters if your goal is to be a Western liberal democracy. So we can take a look at some of these normative conclusions here. Most of the assumptions of all the researchers doing research on African prisoner disenfranchisement were assuming that the goal was to model Western forms of statehood, that they were assuming that the goal was to become a liberal democracy just like the European countries that had colonized Africa. And that's not necessarily the goal of most African countries today. This idea of liberal democracy creates a system of winners and losers, with the West obviously being the winners and African countries largely being the losers. As a result of this, as well as colonization, prisons were not actually inherently African up until Europeans colonized the continent and used prisons to subjugate those populations and create this kind of colonization that they were looking for. So prisons are not necessarily an African thing from the get-go, so why are they still there? And when we're looking at Africantication, this idea that we want to embrace Africanness without the stereotypes and the harm from colonization, we can see that this kind of liberal democracy is not necessarily the goal. And so a lot of African leaders have been talking about getting rid of the relics of colonialism, following African systems of governance, getting back to those traditional systems that occurred before colonization, and looking for African solutions to African problems rather than following these Western models of statehood, Western models of economy, and Western ideas that were forced on the continent against their will. So the question shouldn't be, should prisoners be allowed to vote? It should be, should prisoners be allowed? And so further research might look into why these prisons are still such a major part of politics and institutions on the continent when so many leaders have been trying to get rid of those relics of colonization in the first place. So to look at some study limitations here, first there was a lack of available data and reliable data. Obviously when you're studying the continent of Africa, sometimes there's just not going to be data available, sometimes that data is not going to be reliable. So we did have some missing data. We're only able to study 46 of the 55 countries on the continent. We were lacking a bit of a qualitative element. I really wanted to get some surveys or some interviews done, but we just ran out of time, so that's another thing that could be incorporated into future studies, as well as lacking on-the-ground perspective from groups working on prisoner enfranchisement, groups working on prisoner rights. And finally, there was, of course, my own bias as a white girl from South Carolina studying Africa, and as you can see, there were assumption flaws in all of the researchers studying this issue because everyone was assuming that the goal was a Western liberal democracy. So I just want to conclude by thanking Dr. Day for putting up with me throughout this and throughout all my changes of ideas, especially at the last minute, the Political Science Department and the Honors College for encouraging me to do this project. And thank you all for listening.